"Get out, old man. This isn't your house anymore." Those words didn't come from a stranger. They came from my own daughter Vanessa, standing at the marble doorway of the Santa Barbara beachfront villa I had helped her buy. "My name is Lawrence Aldridge, and I'm 74 years old. For nearly 5 decades, I was an architect drawing lines that turned into steel beams and concrete foundations, shaping homes for other families to thrive in. I thought my final years would be spent in peace, surrounded by my own family. Instead, on that September afternoon, I found myself cast out from the very house I had poured my savings into, $250,000. That was the amount I withdrew from my retirement account to give Vanessa and her husband Brandon so they could afford this villa. A Mediterranean-style estate with terracotta roof tiles, imported Italian chandeliers, and a sweeping view of the Pacific Ocean. I had believed I was buying all of us a future together. But as I stood there with the ocean wind biting my face, I realized all I had bought was betrayal. Vanessa's voice trembled with anger, but her eyes glittered with something colder: victory. Behind her, Brandon leaned against the spiral staircase railing, arms crossed, a smirk carved into his face. The living room behind them still smelled of new leather and fresh paint. On the polished oak table sat a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, $5,000, I remembered, because I had paid for it during our celebration dinner. I clutched the copy of the cashier's check I had given them, $250,000, my entire nest egg still folded in my jacket pocket. I had kept it as a reminder of the day I thought my family's dreams were coming true. Now it felt like the cruelest piece of paper in the world. "You don't belong here anymore, Dad," Vanessa said, her diamond ring catching the chandelier light as she gestured toward the door. Her voice sliced the air as cleanly as a scalpel. "This is our home now," Brandon added casually, his tone dripping with disdain. "We need space, privacy. You understand." Understand. That word burned. I had understood when Vanessa cried in my arms at the bank, promising me we would live as a family. I had understood when Brandon insisted the villa needed renovations before we moved in, siphoning more from my account. And I had understood when they told me, smiling sweetly, that my bedroom overlooked the sea, so I could wake each morning to the sound of the waves. But standing there being told to leave, I finally understood the truth. The mug of coffee I had been holding slipped from my hand, shattering against the marble floor. Dark liquid bled into the veins of the stone like a spreading wound. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the grand hall. Then Vanessa folded her arms and said coldly, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I looked past them at the framed family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Christmas morning just last year, Vanessa laughing in her red sweater. Brandon grinning beside her, me holding the golden retriever they had since rehomed because dogs shed too much. That photograph mocked me now, a reminder of promises broken, of love traded for luxury. I straightened my shoulders. Years of bending over drafting tables had curved my spine, but my voice remained steady. "I gave you everything," I said softly. "Every dollar was meant to build a home for all of us." Vanessa's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Things change, Dad. You'll be fine." Behind her, Brandon whispered something in her ear that made her giggle. That sound, cruel and dismissive, echoed louder in my ears than the crashing surf outside. I turned toward the door. My hand lingered on the cool brass handle, the one I had personally selected during the renovations, because it reminded me of the home your mother and I once built together. My late wife, Eleanor, would never have imagined this ending. As I stepped into the salty air of the California coast, Brandon called out behind me, "Good luck, old man. You'll need it." But my smile, faint and deliberate, froze them both. It wasn't the smile of defeat. It was the smile of a man who has just seen the cracks in a structure others believe is indestructible. And I know more than anyone, cracks always spread. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Stories like mine need to be heard far and wide because betrayal hides in the most familiar faces. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked down the stone steps, the Pacific breeze whipping against my skin. The villa rose behind me, gleaming in the sun, a palace built on my sacrifice. But they had forgotten something. I was the one who knew how to read blueprints, and I had already started drafting a different kind of plan. I walked slowly down the long driveway of the villa, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes, sounding like the final nails sealing a coffin. The Pacific breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, but for me the air was thick with betrayal. Behind me I could still hear faint laughter, Vanessa and Brandon's voices blending into the waves, as if mocking me with every step I took away from them. I reached my old Lexus parked by the gate, the very car they had sneered at only last week. "Dad, maybe it's time you upgraded," Brandon had said with a smirk, patting the hood of my sedan. Something worthy of living in a house like this. Worthy. That word stung almost as much as today's dismissal. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cracked but familiar, and rested my forehead on the steering wheel. I thought back to the day at the bank 6 months earlier. Vanessa had sat beside me, her hand clutching mine as tears rolled down her perfectly made-up face. "Dad, this is everything we've ever dreamed of. A home by the sea, a place where we'll all be together. I promise you'll never have to worry about being alone again." I believed her. I believed her because faith in family, faith in promises was the cornerstone of my life. I had spent years teaching her that trust was the mortar that held our lives together. That day, as I signed the withdrawal slip for $250,000, I whispered silently, "Lord, bless this home we're building together. Let this be my legacy." Now, staring at the cold, gleaming villa in my rearview mirror, I wondered if perhaps God had allowed me to see the truth sooner rather than later. Maybe this exile wasn't punishment. Maybe it was preparation. Sometimes faith isn't about what you're given, it's about what you're shown. I turned the ignition, the engine humming to life. My hands shook, not from age, but from anger barely contained. The road back to town stretched ahead of me, golden sunlight spilling across the hills of Santa Barbara. I drove past vineyards and gated estates, each one more extravagant than the last. And with every mile the contrast grew sharper, the luxury they now reveled in, and the sacrifices I had made to provide it. Decades of work had gone into that money. Long nights hunched over drafting tables, weekends lost to deadlines, projects that broke my back but never my spirit. I had missed anniversaries, birthdays, even some of Vanessa's school plays, because clients demanded precision. And yet I never regretted it. I thought I was building a future for her, for us. But what good are blueprints if the foundation is rotten? I pulled into a small diner off Highway 101, the kind of place where the coffee is cheap and the waitresses know your name after one visit. Sliding into a booth, I ordered black coffee and watched the steam curl upward. For the first time in years, I felt like an outsider in my own story. At the counter, 2 men in golf shirts chatted about their club memberships. Their conversation carried easily annual dues, imported wine at the clubhouse, new BMWs in the parking lot. I thought of Brandon boasting just last week that he had been shortlisted for the Montecito Country Club. A man in my position needs the right connections, he had said loudly, making sure I heard. He had smiled that smug smile as if to remind me I no longer belonged to his world. The truth is, I had never wanted that world. I had wanted Sunday dinners, laughter at Christmas, grandchildren playing on the floor by the fireplace. I had wanted family. Instead, I had funded extravagance. The waitress, a kind woman with tired eyes, refilled my cup. "Rough day?" she asked gently. I managed a faint smile, just realizing some things I should have seen sooner. "Sometimes the Lord has to show us the cracks before the whole wall comes down," she said softly, almost as if she could read my thoughts. Her words lingered long after she walked away. Maybe this was God's way of showing me that my trust had been misplaced, that my daughter and her husband weren't the foundation of my life. Maybe I was meant to build something stronger, something of my own before the end of my days. I sipped the bitter coffee, letting the warmth steady me. My heart still ached, but beneath the ache was a flicker of something unexpected resolve. They had shut the door, but in doing so they had given me freedom. As I paid my bill and stepped back into the cool evening air, I looked toward the mountains rising in the distance. Their peaks glowed gold in the setting sun, unmoved by time, unshaken by storms. I whispered quietly, almost a prayer. "Maybe you've put me here for a reason, and maybe the fight I'm about to begin is the one you want me to win." I didn't know then how deep their betrayal truly went. I didn't yet see the forged signatures, the hidden debts, the structural lies buried beneath that villa's gleaming facade. But I knew this, I would not go quietly. I tightened my coat, climbed back into my car, and drove toward the motel where I'd spend the night. The neon sign flickered against the twilight sky vacancy. A cheap room, a thin mattress. But for the first time in weeks, I felt clarity. This wasn't the end. It was the blueprint for my revenge. The motel room smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant. The kind of place travelers used for a single night and tried to forget by morning. I sat on the edge of the bed, the glow of the bedside lamp casting a weak circle of light over the stack of documents I'd pulled from my leather briefcase. Vanessa and Brandon thought they'd pushed me out of their lives for good. But they forgot something. I was an architect for more than 40 years. I learned how to study details most people ignore. A crooked line, a hidden crack, a signature that doesn't quite belong. I knew how to see the flaws in structures and in people. I laid out the photocopy of the cashier's check I'd given them, $250,000. Next to it, I placed a copy of the villa's original listing that Vanessa had emailed me months ago. I adjusted my glasses, squinting at the fine print. My stomach tightened. The asking price hadn't been what they told me. The villa was listed at $2.05 million, but Vanessa had sworn the price was 2.3s. My contribution was supposed to cover the down payment and renovations. So where did the extra $250,000 go? I flipped through my bank app, scrolling past lines of transactions. That's when I saw it, an electronic transfer out of Vanessa's account, made just a week after closing. $80,000 wired to an account I didn't recognize. The recipient's name was blurred under some vague corporate entity, Hale Consulting, LLC. Brandon's handiwork. I pressed my palms together, steadying my breath. They hadn't just deceived me about my place in their home. They had siphoned money for themselves, hidden under false names and business expenses. The motel walls seemed to close in on me. I stood pacing the worn carpet, every step releasing more anger than the last. My phone buzzed. A message from an old friend, Gregory Marsh, a retired lawyer who'd once lived next door to me before I moved in with Vanessa. "Lawrence, I heard about the house. Stop by when you can. I've got something you need to see." The next morning, I drove across town to Gregory's cottage, a modest stucco home tucked between bougainvillea bushes. He met me at the door, a stack of papers in his hands. "I came across this in a file search last week," he said, ushering me inside. "Did you know that property on Cabrillo Drive failed inspection 5 years ago?" My brows furrowed. Failed inspection. He handed me the report. The words jumped off the page: foundation irregularities, soil compaction insufficient, recommended remediation $150,000 minimum. I nearly dropped the folder. Vanessa never mentioned this. Gregory shook his head. Of course she didn't. The previous owners should have disclosed it. But the realtor found a way to bury it in the paperwork. Probably thought no one would notice once they had a buyer desperate enough. I ran my hand over the document, my architect's mind racing. A house with foundation problems wasn't just a bad investment. It was a ticking time bomb. And Vanessa had dragged me into it willingly. They promised me I'd always have a home there. I whispered. They didn't just betray me emotionally. They trapped me in a lie worth millions. Gregory's eyes softened. "Lawrence, I've seen a lot of ugly family disputes in my years of practice. But this is calculated. They didn't just want your money. They wanted your silence while they cleaned up their mess." Silence. That word echoed in my mind. They thought I'd go quietly, that I'd slink away to a motel and vanish. I set the report down and looked Gregory in the eye. They miscalculated. That evening, back at the motel, I laid the new evidence beside the bank slips. The puzzle was beginning to form. Brandon and Vanessa hadn't simply pushed me out, they were covering their tracks. My money hadn't secured me a home. It had bought them time status and a shield against a house that was sinking into California soil. I leaned back in the stiff motel chair, staring at the ceiling. Every betrayal left a paper trail, and every paper trail led to truth. And truth, when wielded correctly, could shatter the strongest walls. My phone buzzed again. A new email notification appeared from Santa Barbara Title and Escrow. I opened it, and my heart pounded as the PDF loaded. A loan application dated 3 months earlier. My name typed neatly at the bottom. My signature forged perfectly. A loan against the villa. $80,000. My hands shook as I printed the file. Vanessa's betrayal had grown teeth, and now those teeth were sunk deep into my very identity. I stacked the papers neatly as though arranging blueprints for a skyscraper. Because that's what this was, blueprints for something bigger than they could imagine. I whispered to myself the words steady as a vow. They built their palace on sand, and I'm going to watch it fall. The next morning, the sky over Santa Barbara was a pale gray, the kind of coastal morning that made the ocean look like a sheet of hammered steel. I stood by the motel window, Gregory's inspection report in one hand and the forged loan application in the other. Together they were damning proof. Proof that my daughter and her husband weren't just greedy, they were reckless criminals, I poured a cup of lukewarm motel coffee, the kind that tasted faintly of cardboard, and spread the documents across the small table. In my years as an architect, I'd learned to recognize when a building was doomed. You could hear it in the way walls groaned, see it in the hairline cracks spreading across the foundation. And I realized now Vanessa and Brandon's entire life was built the same way. All shine on the surface, rotting beneath. I scrolled through my phone and opened Vanessa's Instagram. There it was, a photo she'd posted just 2 days earlier. She stood on the marble steps of the villa dressed in a silk robe holding a glass of champagne. The caption read, "Living the dream. Grateful for everything we've built." Built. That word gnawed at me. What they had built wasn't a dream. It was a cage lined with lies, and they'd tried to lock me inside it until I was no longer useful. I zoomed in on the photo. Behind her smile, I saw a faint crack running diagonally across the stucco wall near the window. Most people would scroll past without noticing. But to me it screamed louder than her smug grin. A knock on the motel door startled me. I opened it to find Gregory again holding a folded newspaper. "Lawrence, you need to see this," he said grimly. On the front page of the Santa Barbara Tribune was an article rising concerns over coastal properties with foundation issues. The photo wasn't Vanessa's villa, but it might as well have been. Same era of construction, same cliffside soil. The article warned buyers about millions in hidden costs, lawsuits piling up, families ruined. "Your daughter's house could be next on the list," Gregory said, tapping the paper. I felt a strange calm settle over me. They thought they had the upper hand, but the ground beneath them literally was failing. And I had the receipts to prove it. I sat back, exhaling slowly. Maybe this was God's way of reminding me that truth always finds its way to the surface. That no matter how carefully lies are painted over, the cracks will show. I folded the paper and slipped it into my folder of evidence. The weight of it felt less like paper and more like a weapon. As the day waned, I returned to the villa not to confront them, not yet, but to observe. I parked across the street in the shadow of a jacaranda tree. Through the large windows I could see Brandon striding through the living room, phone pressed to his ear, pacing with the agitation of a man in trouble. Vanessa stood by the grand piano, her arms crossed, her face pale. They were already unraveling, already sensing the walls closing in. I whispered to myself, "You think you've locked me out, but I'm already inside your foundation and I know exactly where to press." Before leaving, I snapped a few photos of the cracks around the property. Evidence. Every image a nail in the coffin of their scheme. That night, back in my motel, I opened a fresh notebook and began to outline a plan. Step by step, like drafting a new design, collect more evidence, file complaints. Contact the right inspectors, prepare legal action. The kind of blueprint that didn't build walls or ceilings, but justice. I closed the notebook, placed it neatly beside my bed, and for the first time in weeks, slept without tossing. Because I finally understood they hadn't thrown me out of my home. They had given me the distance I needed to build my revenge. If you're still with me up to this point, type 1 in the comments, so I know you're walking this road with me. The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific, wrapping Santa Barbara in a gray hush. I woke in the motel room with one thought burning through me like a blueprint etched in fire. It was time to stop being the victim and start being the architect again. On the table beside me lay the folder of evidence I'd gathered so far. Gregory's inspection report, the fraudulent loan application, the discrepancies in the house listing, and the photos I'd taken of the villa's cracks. Each page was another brick, and I was building something sturdier than any house a case. I brewed the motel's weak coffee and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Tom, it's Lawrence. I need your expertise." Thomas Brennan had been a structural engineer on several of my largest projects back in the 90s. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, but old colleagues in our line of work never forget the battles fought together on construction sites. "Lawrence Aldridge," he said, surprise lacing his voice. "Haven't heard from you since the Riviera Towers project." "What's going on?" "I've got a house with foundation problems," I replied evenly. "Serious ones. And I need an independent inspection report." Quietly. There was a pause, then a low whistle. "Foundation problems in Santa Barbara. That's never cheap. You want me to take a look?" "Yes. And Tom, bring your toughest standards. I want this report airtight." We arranged to meet the following afternoon at the property. As I hung up, I felt a surge of energy I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Vanessa and Brandon pushed me out, I wasn't just reacting. I was moving first. I spent the rest of the morning at the public library, hunched over a computer combing through public records. The villa's address pulled up a series of permits and violations, electrical rewiring that hadn't been finalized, landscaping approvals that mentioned concealing settlement lines. And then I found it, a 2018 complaint filed by a previous neighbor about soil erosion on that very cliffside. The city had closed it pending further investigation, which meant it had likely been swept under the rug. I printed everything and added it to my growing dossier. As I left the library, my phone buzzed. A notification from Facebook. My stomach tightened as I opened it. There it was, Vanessa's post. "Please pray for my father. He's been confused and unstable lately. He's spreading lies about us, and we fear for his safety. Dementia runs in our family, and we're doing our best to get him help." The comments poured in. Old friends of hers, colleagues of Brandon's neighbors I once greeted at the grocery store, all offering sympathy for them, pity for me. So sad. Elder abuse goes both ways. Get him evaluated. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. They weren't just cutting me out. They were dismantling my reputation brick by brick the way termites hollow a beam from the inside. But instead of anger, I felt something sharper, clarity. They had made their move. Now I had justification to hit back harder. I drove past the villa that evening, parking in the shadows again. Through the tall windows, I could see them entertaining guests. Crystal glasses clinked. Brandon strutted in his tailored suit, Vanessa in her designer dress. Their guests laughed, oblivious to the cracks running through the very foundation beneath them. I snapped a photo from across the street, glamour on the surface, rot beneath. It would make the perfect opening slide in the file I was preparing. Back at the motel, I spread the documents across the bed and organized them into sections: financial fraud, forged loan application, suspicious transfers. Structural defects inspection reports, city complaints, my photos. Defamation screenshots of their posts, comments, lies spread online. I labeled each folder in my precise architect's handwriting, the same way I'd once labeled floor plans. My hands didn't tremble. They were steady, almost calm. When I finished, I sat back staring at the neat stack. This wasn't just evidence. It was a demolition plan. Not for a building, but for the false empire my daughter and her husband had built with my money. And I whispered to the silence of the motel room, "You wanted me gone. Now I'm coming back." but not as the man you cast out, as the man who will bury you in the truth. The storm had begun. The day of the inspection arrived with a sky as clear as glass. I drove to Cabrillo Drive early, my pulse steady but strong the way it had been on mornings before presenting a major project to a client. Except this time the client wasn't a corporation, it was truth itself. Tom Brennan pulled up in a dusty white pickup hard hat on the dashboard clipboard under his arm. He was older like me, gray in his beard lines around his eyes, but the same meticulous fire burned behind his gaze. "Let's see what kind of mess they bought," he said, clapping my shoulder. We walked around the villa's perimeter, and Tom didn't need long. He crouched by the east wall, running his fingers over the fissures like a doctor palpating a wound. "See this differential settlement? Soil compaction failure. These cracks are only going to widen. Minimum fix, 150 grand. And that's just to stabilize it. Full remediation could run closer to 250. I took photos of every angle he pointed out. He dictated notes, and I wrote them in my architect's neat block letters. It wasn't just documentation, it was ammunition. Vanessa spotted us from the window and stormed out, fury etched across her face. "What are you doing here, Dad? You can't just bring strangers to our property." Tom straightened his hard hat, tucked under his arm, utterly unshaken. "Ma'am, I'm a licensed structural engineer, and this house has problems. Serious ones." Her eyes darted between us, then back to the cracks she had no hope of explaining away. She hissed, "Leave. Now." I met her glare and said calmly, "Truth doesn't leave just because you order it to." That night, back in the motel, I placed Tom's preliminary report alongside the forged loan documents. My dossier was becoming undeniable. Still doubt crept in. This was my daughter, the child I'd once carried on my shoulders at Disneyland, the little girl who used to draw castles beside me while I drafted blueprints. Was I really prepared to ruin her? I sat on the edge of the bed, Bible in hand. My late wife Eleanor had always read from Psalms when life became unbearable. I turned to a page marked long ago by her handwriting. "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." I closed my eyes. Maybe this is why I was left standing when Eleanor passed. Maybe God kept me here for this because someone had to hold Vanessa accountable, even if it broke my heart. The next morning, I decided silence was no longer my duty. Exposure was. I walked into the office of the Santa Barbara Tribune, a manila envelope under my arm. The receptionist looked up, startled at the sight of an older man carrying what must have looked like state secrets. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with an investigative reporter," I said, my voice firm. "It's about fraud, real estate violations, and elder exploitation." Within an hour, I was seated across from a young journalist named Rachel Nguyen, who listened intently as I laid out the evidence. Every photo, every forged signature, every inspection report. Her pen raced across the page. "Mr. Aldridge, this is staggering," she said finally. "If what you're showing me checks out, this isn't just a family dispute. It's fraud. Public interest fraud." "Then print it," I said. "Because my daughter and her husband are destroying more than just me. They're lying to banks, to buyers, to this city. And it's time someone knew." By that evening, the story was online. Elderly architect claims daughter defrauded him in coastal villa purchase. My photo wasn't there, but the villa's street name was. Within hours, comments flooded in. Some doubted, of course, but many others asked questions. Neighbors chimed in. I saw inspectors at that property months ago. Always wondered why that sale went through so fast. The tide was turning. I sat by the motel window watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. My phone buzzed with notification after notification, but I ignored them. Instead, I whispered a prayer, "Lord, give me the strength to see this through." Not for revenge, but for justice. Not to destroy her, but to reveal the truth she tried to bury. Out there on the cliffside villa, Vanessa and Brandon were probably raging. Their polished facade was cracking in the public eye. And I, an old man they thought too weak to matter, was the one driving the wedge. I leaned back, folding my hands over the open Bible, and allowed myself the smallest smile. The war had begun, and I was no longer outnumbered. I had faith, truth, and evidence on my side. And soon the world would see what kind of foundation they had really built their lives upon. The Santa Barbara courthouse stood against the morning sky like a fortress of stone and glass, its marble steps gleaming in the coastal sun. I climbed them slowly, cane in one hand, manila briefcase in the other, each step heavier with the weight of years, but lighter with the purpose I carried inside. 3 months had passed since Vanessa and Brandon had thrown me out of the villa. In those months, I had rebuilt myself into something sharper than they could have imagined, not a discarded old man, but a plaintiff armed with truth. Today, all of it would be laid bare. Inside courtroom 3C, the air was charged with tension. Wooden pews creaked as people filled the seats. Neighbors, curious onlookers, even a few reporters scribbling notes. At the plaintiff's table, I sat with my attorney, Rebecca Carter, a woman with sharp features and sharper instincts. She had spent 2 decades unraveling financial fraud, and when she spoke, people listened. Across from us, Vanessa sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. She wore a navy suit that looked borrowed, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Beside her, Brandon couldn't mask his arrogance. His tailored jacket, gold watch, and perpetual smirk screamed the same message he'd been peddling for months. I'm untouchable. The bailiff called for order, and Judge Evelyn Harper, a woman with 30 years on the bench, entered with the gravitas of someone who had seen every form of human betrayal. She surveyed the courtroom, her gaze sharp as a scalpel. This court is now in session. The case of Aldridge versus Aldridge and Hale. Rebecca rose for the opening statement. Her voice was measured calm, but every word struck like a hammer. Your Honor, this is not merely a dispute between father and daughter. This is a case of financial fraud, identity theft, and intentional concealment of property defects. My client, Mr. Lawrence Aldridge, entrusted his life savings, $250,000, to the defendants under the promise of shared family residence. Instead, they not only excluded him, they forged his signature to secure additional loans, defamed his character publicly, and concealed foundation failures that make the property uninhabitable. We will prove that these actions were not mistakes, but deliberate, calculated betrayals. Gasps murmured through the courtroom. I glanced at Vanessa. Her lips quivered, but Brandon sat stone-faced, jaw tight. Their lawyer, a young man who looked barely out of law school, fumbled through his rebuttal. Your Honor, this is a family misunderstanding. Financial stress, emotional strain. Mr. Aldridge is elderly and perhaps misremembering some details. Judge Harper raised a hand. Counselor, I've heard this tactic before. If you want to discredit a witness, bring evidence, not insinuations. The defense lawyer flushed crimson. The first witness was Tom Brennan. He stepped forward with his clipboard and photographs enlarged onto poster boards. Your Honor, I conducted a structural analysis of the property in question. The villa suffers from severe differential settlement due to improper soil compaction. Cracks in the foundation indicate ongoing instability. Remediation costs will exceed $150,000 minimum. In my professional opinion, the defects were present long before purchase. He pointed to the photo's jagged lines running up stucco walls, misaligned door frames, sloping floors. The jury, 6 men and 6 women, leaned forward, visibly disturbed. Next came Gregory, my retired lawyer neighbor. He testified about the inspection reports buried in the sale and the neighborhood gossip that confirmed the defects had been common knowledge. Everyone knew about that cliffside lot, he said. The soil was bad. Buyers walked away. Until Mr. Aldridge's daughter came along with her father's money. Then it was my turn. Rebecca guided me gently through my testimony. I told the court about the bank withdrawal, the promises of Sunday dinners and Christmases, together the forged loan I had discovered, and the smear campaign that painted me as senile. As I spoke, my voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each word. I held up the inspection reports, the screenshots of Vanessa's posts, the forged loan papers with my signature. The jury watched closely. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Finally, Rebecca played the recording from Murphy's Diner, the meeting where I confronted Vanessa and Brandon about the forged loan. The jury heard my daughter's stammering denials, Brandon's growl of, "This isn't over, old man," and the sound of their retreat. The courtroom was silent when the recording ended. Only the faint scratching of the court reporter's pen broke the stillness. Judge Harper's eyes swept the defense table. "Counselor, do your clients wish to respond to this evidence?" Brandon leaned forward, his mask cracking. It wasn't fraud. It was necessity. The old man wasn't going to use that money anyway. Better it go toward keeping the house afloat than rotting in his account. The words hung in the air like a confession. Vanessa buried her face in her hands. The defense attorney stammered. "Objection, Your Honor." Overruled, Judge Harper snapped. "The defendant's own statement will be entered into the record." I sat back, my heart pounding but calm. The blueprint was working. Piece by piece, their carefully built facade was crumbling. And as I looked at my daughter, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched, I whispered a silent prayer. "Lord, I don't know what tomorrow brings, but thank you for giving me the strength to face today." The afternoon sun slanted through the tall courthouse windows, painting golden lines across the polished wood. The jury had been sent out an hour earlier, leaving the room heavy with silence. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, my Bible resting quietly atop the folder of evidence. Across the aisle, Vanessa twisted a tissue to shreds, while Brandon stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack, like the foundation of that villa. When the bailiff finally called the jury back and the hush in courtroom 3C deepened, Judge Harper looked down at the foreperson. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the papers, handed them to the judge, who read silently before returning them. Judge Harper's voice was steady, but every word hit like a gavel. "On the charge of financial fraud, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Lawrence Aldridge. The defendants are ordered to return the full sum of $250,000, plus the additional $80,000 obtained through fraudulent loans with interest." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Vanessa's shoulders slumped, the last of her composure crumbling. Brandon muttered something under his breath, but the gavel's sharp crack silenced him. On the charge of defamation, we find in favor of the plaintiff. The defendants must issue public retractions and apologies across all platforms where false statements were made. I closed my eyes briefly. I thought of the Facebook post that had painted me as a confused old man unfit to be trusted. The shame of walking into the grocery store and seeing familiar faces avoid me. That stain would be lifted, now replaced by the truth. Judge Harper leaned forward. Finally, on the matter of identity theft, this court refers the evidence to the district attorney for criminal investigation. Gasps erupted. Vanessa broke into sobs, clutching the tissue, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. Brandon slammed his fist against the table. "This is a witch hunt. He's manipulating everyone enough," the judge barked. "One more outburst, Mr. Hale, and I'll hold you in contempt." Rebecca touched my arm, her smile calm but fierce. "We did it," she whispered. The judge concluded, "This court finds that the defendants acted with malice, exploiting the trust of a father and attempting to destroy his reputation. Justice demands restitution." Case closed. The gavel struck, and it was over. The room erupted in noise, reporters scribbling furiously, neighbors whispering. I rose slowly, cane in hand, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders, as though 40 years of burdens had been set down at once. Vanessa looked up at me through her tears. For a moment I thought she might say something, but Brandon grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the door, their lawyer trailing behind, with a face pale as paper. Outside, the courthouse steps gleamed in the late sun. Reporters clustered, microphones ready. "Mr. Aldridge, how do you feel about the verdict?" I paused, the marble cool under my shoes, the Pacific breeze brushing my face. "I feel," I said slowly, "the truth always stands, even when family falls. And I thank God for giving me the strength to endure until this day." Camera shutters clicked. The words were already leaving my mouth and flying into headlines. Behind me, Rebecca clutched the judgment papers, Gregory nodded in quiet approval, and Tom Brennan carried his thick folder of engineering reports, like a soldier returning from battle. We walked down the steps together, allies who had emerged from the wreckage of betrayal. As I reached the sidewalk, I saw it 2 signs planted in the manicured lawn outside the courthouse. One read, "For sale, 17 Cabrillo Drive." The villa, their palace, their prize, it was already being surrendered to the banks. I smiled, not with malice, but with the calm satisfaction of justice done. My money would be restored, my name cleared, their lies shattered under the gavel's weight. For a moment I thought of Eleanor, my late wife, her gentle faith, her steady hand. "Truth is like light, Lawrence," she once told me. "You can cover it for a while, but eventually it shines through." I lifted my eyes toward the mountains beyond the city, their peaks steady against the setting sun. Yes, light had broken through. And though I had lost the daughter I once knew, I had gained back something priceless: dignity, vindication, and peace. I whispered quietly, almost a prayer, "Lord, thank you. The blueprint is complete." And with that, I stepped off the courthouse steps, free at last. The weeks after the verdict passed like the quiet after a storm. The headlines faded from the papers, the courthouse whispers died down, and Santa Barbara returned to its rhythm of ocean breezes and swaying palms. But my life had changed forever. The restitution payments began arriving, transfers ordered by the court, every dollar accounted for. $250,000 plus the $80,000 Brandon had siphoned through his shell company, all wired back into my account. Numbers on a screen, yes, but to me it was more than money. It was 40 years of sacrifice restored. It was dignity repaid. I didn't waste time looking back at Cabrillo Drive. Reports trickled in. Neighbors said the villa sat empty, foreclosure looming, foundation cracks widening with every tide. They had lost their palace of glass. And though part of me pitied Vanessa, I knew I couldn't build my future on pity. Instead, I turned toward the mountains where the air was clearer, the ground steadier. I found a modest ranch-style home in Montecito, a place with sturdy beams and a wide porch overlooking groves of orange trees. The first time I stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. No chandeliers, no marble floors, no pretentious luxury. Just honest wood sunlight spilling through big windows and a yard waiting for roses and tomatoes. I spent my mornings in the garden, hands deep in soil the way Eleanor used to. I planted tomatoes, peppers, and roses along the fence. Each seedling felt like a promise that life could still bloom after betrayal. In the afternoons, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the waves in the distance and the hum of bees around the citrus blossoms. Neighbors came by with pies and casseroles, welcoming me with warmth that felt truer than any of the champagne toasts Brandon once made. They didn't see me as a wallet or a burden. They saw me as Lawrence, the man who had lived, endured, and still stood. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun melted into the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In my hands was a letter cream-colored, written in Vanessa's familiar script. It had arrived that morning, forwarded from my old P.O. box. Dad, it began. We know we don't deserve forgiveness. We lost everything: the villa, our savings, even our friends. Brandon is working construction now. I clean houses. We're starting therapy, trying to understand how we became the people who hurt you. We don't expect reconciliation. We just hope someday you'll believe we've changed. I set the letter on my lap, staring at the horizon. A part of me wanted to remember her as the little girl with skinned knees running through the backyard with laughter that echoed like bells. But I knew better than to let nostalgia rewrite truth. Trust once shattered doesn't rebuild overnight. I whispered softly into the cooling air. I forgive you, Vanessa. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. The porch creaked as I shifted, sipping coffee gone lukewarm. Inside the house smelled faintly of wood polish and fresh paint. No shouting, no false promises, no manipulation. Just silence, the good kind. It struck me then, this was the life I should have been building all along. Not palaces of stone for others to squander, but a refuge of my own, strong in its simplicity. A home not bought by extravagance, but by faith, perseverance, and the hard-earned wisdom of years. When night fell, I turned on the single lamp in the living room and opened Eleanor's old Bible. My fingers found the verse she'd underlined decades ago: unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. I closed the book, heart steady. The Lord had let their palace crumble, but He had given me this place, this garden, this peace, and I would tend it with gratitude. Outside, the wind rustled the orange trees, carrying the scent of blossoms through the open window. My new beginning had taken root. Spring settled gently over Montecito, painting the hillsides with wildflowers and the air with the fragrance of orange blossoms. My new home no longer felt like just a house, it had become a sanctuary. The garden flourished under my care, the tomatoes climbing taller each week, the roses unfurling their crimson petals. Every morning I walked the rows with my cane feeling the soil beneath my shoes, hearing the hum of bees. It was a different kind of architecture, not of steel and stone, but of patience, faith, and living things. One Sunday, I sat on the porch with Eleanor's Bible open on my lap. The verse I had stumbled upon weeks earlier echoed in my mind. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. I had spent my life building for others towers that touched the sky, villas on cliffsides, even palaces for my own family. But those structures crumbled when love and honesty were absent. Only now, with these modest walls and this honest garden, did I understand what it meant to truly build a house blessed by God. Sometimes in the stillness of dusk, I thought of Vanessa. I imagined her in some cramped apartment with Brandon struggling to make rent, cleaning other people's homes. I thought of the letter she had written, apologetic, sorrowful, begging for a chance at redemption. And while my heart softened enough to forgive, I knew forgiveness didn't mean I had to let them back into my life. Faith had taught me that boundaries too could be holy. Some bridges once burned are meant to remain ash. Neighbors often asked how I found the strength to take them to court, to endure the slander, to stand alone. My answer was always the same. When lies are the foundation, collapse is inevitable. And sometimes God lets you see the cracks, so you'll stop patching them with denial. One evening, as the sun melted into the Pacific, turning the horizon into fire and gold, I raised a glass of simple red wine, not the $1,000 Bordeaux Brandon once flaunted, but a modest vintage from the grocery store. I toasted the air, whispered quietly, to dignity, to faith, to beginnings that come even in our 70s. And I want to pause here and speak directly to you, the one listening to my story. Maybe you felt used, discarded, betrayed by the very people who should have cherished you most. Maybe you've wondered if starting over so late in life is even possible. Let me tell you, yes, it is. I'm living proof. At 74, I lost what I thought was everything. But in truth, I gained what mattered most: clarity, freedom, and peace. They thought I was just an old man with shaky hands and fading years. But I had 40 years of experience in seeing what others tried to hide. And with God's help, I used it to reclaim my life. So if you take nothing else from my story, take this: your worth is not defined by what others steal from you. It is defined by what you choose to build after they're gone. The mountains behind my house glowed purple in the fading light, their peaks unchanging, unshaken by storms. I smiled, knowing I had finally become like those mountains, steadfast, no longer swayed by the shifting winds of other people's greed. Now I'll ask you, my friend who's listened all the way here, if this story touched you. Please share it, subscribe to Brian's Story, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this truth can travel. Because betrayal may travel fast, but truth travels farther. And faith carries it the farthest of all.